Welcome to Criminal Minds. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most perplexing missing person cases in recent American history. The sun rose on May 13th, 2008, like any other Tuesday in Marshall, Minnesota. Spring was in the air, and the fields were just starting to show signs of life after the long winter. In the quiet streets of town, there was little indication that anything was about to change. 19-year-old Brandon Swanson rolled out of bed that morning with relief. The finals were over. His first year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College had come to an end. For many students, that meant parties, plans, and excitement. For Brandon, it meant heading home, reconnected with friends, and preparing for a summer filled with simple things. Family dinners, driving back roads, and maybe catching up on the books he loved. He was studying wind turbine technology, an emerging field that aligned with his curious mind and love for problem solving. His parents, Brian and Annette, had always encouraged him to find something that challenged him. They described their son as logical and quiet, but deeply compassionate. The kind of kid who never skipped class and never lost his temper. On that day, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Brandon was smiling when he left the house, keys in hand, glasses perched on his nose like always. He was planning to go to Canby, a small town about 30 miles away, to celebrate the end of the semester with friends from school. He told his parents he wouldn't be out late. It wasn't going to be a wild party, just a small gathering of classmates, drinks, music, conversation. Annette remembers watching him pull out of the driveway with a sense of quiet pride. Her son was growing up. She had no idea it would be the last time she would ever see him. Canby, Minnesota, is a town of under 2,000 people, nestled in the flat expanse of yellow Medicine County. The roads are mostly straight, the air clean, and the kind of silence you find only in the heartland hangs over everything after dusk. Everyone knows everyone in a place like Canby. It's where handshakes still matter, where the corner diner never changes its menu, and where people wave when they pass you on the road, even if they don't know your name. Brandon Swanson fit into that world, but he also dreamed beyond it. That's why he chose to study wind energy, something practical, innovative, and full of future potential. He wasn't reckless like some of his peers. He didn't drink excessively, and he wasn't prone to making impulsive choices. But he was curious, independent, and precise. That evening, the party in Canby wasn't wild. It wasn't even much of a party. Truth be told, a few friends, some casual drinks, music playing low in the background, and the steady hum of conversation about finals and the upcoming summer. Those who were there later described Brandon as relaxed, maybe even a little bored. He sipped a few drinks, but didn't appear drunk or even tipsy. As midnight neared, Brandon decided it was time to go. He said his goodbyes, thanking a few people for the invite, and walked out into the cool night air. The road stretched ahead of him, a straight shot back to Marshall, or so he thought. His 2001 Chevy Lumina purred to life, headlights cutting through the night as he pulled onto Highway 68. What happened next remains a puzzle of misplaced geography and tragic miscommunication. Brandon didn't take the direct route home. Instead, he chose a back road, a decision that might have seemed small at the time but would become the fulcrum on which the entire mystery would pivot. Why he took that route is still debated. Some believe he wanted to avoid being pulled over, perhaps cautious about having had even a small amount to drink. Others think he simply preferred the quiet roads, where the stars stretch uninterrupted and time seems to slow. Brandon had driven those roads many times. Or at least, he thought he had. It was close to 1:15 a.m. when something went wrong. Brandon called his parents. He told them he had driven into a ditch and couldn't get his car out. He wasn't hurt. He wasn't panicked. He just needed a ride. He was calm and methodical. He explained that he was near Lind, a town about 7 miles southwest of Marshall. Brian and Annette didn't hesitate. They got into their pickup truck and headed toward Lind. As they drove, they stayed on the phone with Brandon. He told them where to look and what intersections he thought he was near. They followed his directions precisely, slowly navigating the dark rural roads, flashing their lights, honking their horn, anything to signal their presence. But Brandon couldn't see them. They couldn't see him either. When they arrived in Lind, Brandon was confused. "I can see the lights of the town," he said, but his parents were parked right in town. Nothing matched up. He insisted he'd meet them halfway, walking toward where he believed they were. Annette offered to pick him up and told him to stay still. But Brandon was sure of his direction. "It's fine," he said. "I'll walk to you." And so they stayed on the phone as he walked. The conversation was mundane, like any you'd have with a family member on a long walk. Brandon commented on landmarks. He thought he was passing fences, gravel roads, perhaps even a stream or two. He was confident he knew where he was headed. His parents, desperate to find him, trusted his instincts. Minutes passed, then half an hour, then 40 minutes. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything changed. Brandon said something unintelligible. Then clearly, distinctly, "Oh, shit." The phone went silent. Not a hang-up, not a disconnection. Just gone. Brian and Annette sat frozen in their truck. They tried calling back. Over and over. The phone rang. No answer. For nearly an hour, they tried to reconnect. Eventually, the call stopped ringing altogether. The phone was either dead or turned off, or destroyed. They drove the roads again, circling, honking, flashing their lights, praying. But the night gave them no clues, no shadow of their son. At 6:30 a.m., they called the police. The reaction from local law enforcement was frustrating, even insulting. "He's 19, they said. He probably just stayed out somewhere. Maybe he's sleeping it off." Annette and Brian were livid. Brandon didn't just disappear. He had been on the phone for nearly an hour, giving details and communicating. This wasn't a runaway. This wasn't a kid who ghosted his parents. This was a disappearance. Eventually, the police relented and began a search. But the delay cost time. Valuable hours when scent trails were freshest, when Brandon might have still been reachable. The search was complicated by one startling discovery. Brandon hadn't been near Lynn at all. His phone's last ping showed him over 20 miles away, near Taunton, a small community northwest of where he claimed to be. It didn't make sense. Brandon knew those roads. He had driven them countless times. How could he have been so far off? Unless, of course, he wasn't where he thought he was. By the time police began actively searching, daylight had broken across the Minnesota farmland. The sky had turned from black to dusty blue, and the open plains were slowly warming under a soft May sun. The Swansons, bleary-eyed and desperate, had not slept. They had spent the early morning hours combing rural roads, playing the last moments of Brandon's call over and over in their minds. The key to the mystery, they hoped, lay in his vehicle. Brandon's phone had last pinged near the town of Taunton, not Lind, where he believed himself to be. Officers from a nearby Lincoln County Sheriff's Department began checking the areas near that location. And not long after, they found it. Brandon's Chevy Lumina sat on the side of a narrow gravel road, just off Lyon Lincoln Road, northwest of Taunton. It wasn't crashed or wrecked. The vehicle had no damage that would indicate a violent event or mechanical failure. The ditch he had driven into wasn't even particularly deep. It was the sort of thing someone might reverse out with some effort. But perhaps in the darkness, Brandon hadn't wanted to risk damaging the undercarriage. The discovery of the car answered one question, but it raised several more, big ones. Why did Brandon think he was near Lynn when he was over 20 miles away? And more urgently, where had he gone from here? There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no obvious tracks. It was as if he had simply stepped out and vanished into the farmland. The terrain around where Brandon's car was found is rural, flat, and deceptively monotonous. Endless fields stretch in every direction, some freshly planted, others rough with uncut prairie grasses. Scattered farms to horizon like islands in a sea of green. There are drainage ditches, gravel roads, and the nearby Yellow Medicine River, which meanders through the region in a quiet, crooked path. Once the location of Brandon's vehicle was confirmed, a new, more targeted search began. Deputies, volunteer teams, and professional trackers converged on the area. Residents, hearing of the situation, joined the effort. They brought ATVs, horses, even drones. The Swansons were there too, every day, hoping, pleading, praying. The breakthrough came not from a person, but from a dog. Search and rescue dogs brought in by investigators picked up Brandon's scent trail. It led them away from the car, down a nearby gravel road and into open fields. The dogs followed the trail through tall grass, then across a small stream. That's when things got strange. The scent reappeared on the other side of the water. That meant Brandon had successfully crossed it. But shortly after, the trail simply stopped. Just stopped. No scent. No personal items. No blood. No indication he had turned around, doubled back, or been taken. The implication was chilling. Whatever happened to Brandon occurred after he had crossed that stream. The phrase haunted everyone involved in the case. "Oh, shit." That was the last thing Brandon said on the phone. It came after 47 minutes of casual conversation, after dozens of reassurances that he could see lights in the distance, that he was on his way, and that everything was under control. And then nothing. It wasn't a scream, not a panic shout. It sounded startled, sudden, like something unexpected had happened. Did he fall? Did he encounter someone? The cell phone never came back online. Its location data couldn't pinpoint exactly where he was, only that general area near Taunton. Despite technological advances, the exact location of that final moment could never be determined with certainty. It was like a breath held in the dark and never released. As the days turned into weeks, the search scaled up. Hundreds of volunteers combed the fields. Helicopters scanned from above. Water rescue teams dredged parts of the Yellow Medicine River, even though it was not particularly deep. But no trace of Brandon was ever found. Not his glasses, which he wore constantly. Not his phone, which should have shown up during the area sweeps. Not his wallet, his shoes, his clothing. Nothing. There was no evidence of foul play. No signs that he had been abducted. No witnesses. No suspicious vehicles were reported in the area. The searchers were baffled. They had dogs, maps, GPS, and experience. And still, they were left with nothing. The emptiness of that silence became its kind of terror. How could a young man, physically capable, leave a trail and then vanish entirely? Theories emerged. Wild animals, river currents, exposure, misadventure. But none of them explained why there was no trace. Nobody, no evidence, no answers. It was as if Brandon had walked into a crack in the earth and disappeared. For Brian and Annette Swanson, the worst part wasn't just losing their son. It was not knowing. They couldn't hold a funeral. They couldn't bury a body. They couldn't even hang on to the comfort of certainty. Every door they passed, every stretch of road, every gust of wind in the cornfields, it all whispered the same haunting question. Where's Brandon? In the weeks after the disappearance, the Swansons barely slept. Annette stopped cooking. Brian stopped going to work. They lived in the map spread out across the dining room table, the piles of reports, and the cell tower data. When the official search efforts began to wind down, they didn't stop. They couldn't. They began organizing volunteer search events, working with private investigators, and lobbying state officials. If the system wasn't to save Brandon, they would make sure it could save someone else. The sun rose and fell again and again over the farmland around Taunton, and with each passing day, the lines between hope and grief blurred for those who knew Brandon Swanson. Search teams continued combing the terrain. Volunteers from across the region drove in to help. Some came with flashlights and walking sticks. Others brought horses and drones. The terrain itself was deceptively complex. Flat, but dense with cornfields, overgrown ditches, and unpredictable waterways. The Yellow Medicine River, while shallow in places, had undercurrents and snags that could entangle a person easily, especially in darkness. But if Brandon had fallen in, why hadn't his body surfaced? Why hadn't anything washed ashore? Divers were brought in again and again. Nothing. The river yielded no clues. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Some picked up faint alerts, but nothing conclusive. At one point, a search team found a piece of clothing, but it turned out to be unrelated. The frustration mounted. Brandon had been so present during that 47-minute phone call. He had described the surroundings in detail. He knew the layout of rural Minnesota. He wasn't disoriented. And yet, the investigators were dealing with a complete absence of evidence. One officer remarked offhandedly, "It's like chasing a ghost." And in many ways, it was. The town of Marshall, and even more so, Taunton, changed in the months after Brandon's disappearance. People locked their doors more often. Some parents kept tighter watch over their teenagers. Rumors spread through cafes and church halls, theories born of desperation and fear. Some speculated Brandon had been abducted, though no one could explain how with so few cars and people out on those roads at that hour. Others suggested he'd fallen victim to an animal attack. But again, no evidence supported that. No torn clothing, no blood, no remains. More chillingly, some whispered darker theories. A local perpetrator, a serial offender, a cover-up. These weren't people who usually believed in conspiracies, but Brandon's vanishing made them question everything. Every local had an opinion. Some were supportive. Others blamed Brandon. Why was he out so late? Why didn't he just stay put? Maybe he was drinking and wandered into trouble. Annette Swanson heard it all, and she responded the same way every time. He called us. He was calm. He was trying to come home. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted search teams. She wanted dogs. She wanted justice. And above all else, she wanted her son back. In the fall of 2008, Annette and Brian channeled their grief into action. The initial reaction from law enforcement, hesitation, delay, skepticism, had left them furious. Brandon was a legal adult, yes, but had still lived at home, had no history of running away, and had called for help. Yet police waited hours before launching a proper search. Those early moments, Annette believed, could have made all the difference. So they pushed for change. In 2009, Minnesota passed Brandon's law, legislation requiring that law enforcement take a missing adult report immediately, especially when the person's safety could be in jeopardy. The law also required cooperation across jurisdictions. No more county lines halting searches or transferring responsibility. It was a solution to Brandon's case, but it might prevent another. For the Swansons, it was a victory carved from tragedy. Still, every time Annette looked out at the fields behind their home, the wind rippling the corn like waves on the ocean, her heart ached. She hadn't found her son. Not yet. Over time, the list of theories surrounding Brandon's disappearance solidified into 4 major categories. He fell into the water and drowned. This was the original and most widely accepted theory. It explained the sudden end of the phone call and the lack of evidence. But extensive searches of the Yellow Medicine River, both immediately after and in the years since, turned up nothing. He succumbed to the elements. May in Minnesota can still be cold at night. Some believe Brandon, disoriented and perhaps mildly intoxicated, wandered too far and collapsed somewhere hidden. Maybe in a culvert, a low ditch, or even a grain silo. Exposure could have claimed him quickly. But again, no physical evidence has ever been found, despite miles of exhaustive search. He was a victim of foul play. Some theorists suggest that Brandon might have come across someone in those dark hours, a stranger, or perhaps someone he knew. There are rural homes, old barns, and isolated roads in that area. Could someone have picked him up or attacked him? If so, how was it kept secret for so long? He staged his disappearance. This theory has the least support. Brandon was close with his family, doing well in school, and showed no signs of distress. His demeanor on the phone was calm. He had no reason to vanish. Still, in the absence of a body, some cling to this idea. Brian and Annette reject it completely. "We knew our son," Annette once said. "He wasn't running from something. He was walking toward home." By the first anniversary of Brandon's disappearance, his parents had learned to live with uncertainty. They no longer expected to be woken by a knock on the door in the middle of the night. They no longer held out hope for a miraculous return, but they hadn't given up either. Annette still took long drives in the countryside, especially around the area where Brandon's car had been found. Sometimes she'd sit on a gravel road for hours, just watching, waiting, listening. Brian kept the porch light on every night for a year. They held a vigil each May, candles flickering under the stars, local families gathering to offer comfort. Somehow, the world had kept moving, but for the Swansons, time had slowed to a crawl. Over a decade has passed since Brandon Swanson vanished, and yet, to his family, the memory of that night is still as sharp as shattered glass. Annette still remembers the exact tone of Brandon's voice. How casual he was. How calm. She can hear it when she closes her eyes. His small, observational comments about where he thought he was walking. Brian still hears the echo of the horn as they honked and linned, hoping he'd see them. He still wonders if they had only driven a few miles west or turned one road sooner. Would they have seen him walking? They don't ask why anymore. They ask where. Grief doesn't end, but it changes. What was once panic became quiet sorrow, then frustration, then something more complicated, a kind of emotional paralysis only those left behind can understand. They are not alone. Thousands of families in America have missing loved ones, but the Swansons' pain is made heavier by the specificity of their story. They were so close. They heard their son. They talked to him. They were only minutes or feet away. And still, he vanished. The road where Brandon's car was found is still there. It hasn't changed much. Gravel still crunches under tires. The tall grass along the ditches still sways with the breeze. The Yellow Medicine River still winds through farmland, shallow and slow. And now and then, a car will pull over. A local, a journalist, a true crime enthusiast. They'll step out, look around, and wonder how someone could vanish in a place so open, so flat, so known. But for Brian and Annette Swanson, it isn't a mystery anymore. It's a scar, a wound with no closure, a son with no grave. Brandon Swanson was last seen on May 14th, 2008. He was 19 years old, wearing blue jeans, a black T-shirt, a white Twins baseball cap, and wire-rimmed glasses. He is still missing. And someone, somewhere, might know what happened. If Brandon's story moved you, share this video. Someone out there may know something. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries.